I'd like to take the opportunity to provide an update on the government's progress in responding to the Infected Blood Inquiry's report. I want to first start by reiterating that the inquiry's final report laid bare harrowing aspects that make it vital we provide regular updates on this work. The infected blood scandal is an injustice that has spanned across decades on an unprecedented scale. Thousands of people have died and continue sadly to die every week. Lives have been shattered and the voices of victims ignored for decades. People have watched their loved ones die, and in one of the most chilling aspects that the inquiry brought to light, children were used as objects of research. It's hard to conceive the scale of the damage done and the incredible suffering of all those impacted. On 20th of May, the country bore witness to the devastating findings of the Infected Blood Inquiry's report. It was a national moment, a profound moment of shame for the British state and a moment of long overdue recognition for the victims and their loved ones. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, in his former role as Leader of the Opposition, acknowledged that suffering was caused by wrongdoing, delay and systemic failure by all parties across the board, compounded by institutional defensiveness. The former Prime Minister issued an apology on behalf of the state for the devastating impact that the use of infected blood and infected blood products has had on countless lives. And today, on behalf of this government, I reiterate that deep and heartfelt sorry. Firstly, let me reassure the House that the government is committed to acting on the findings of the Infected Blood Inquiry report to ensure swift resolution. We're also committed to working on a cross-party basis and will work with others to deliver the compensation scheme and get final payments to victims as soon as possible. It is vital that we shine a penetrating light upon the lessons that must be learnt, and that includes paying comprehensive compensation to those infected and affected by the infected blood scandal. I'd also like to thank honourable members who've played prominent roles in pushing this work to this point. My right honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, has always been, and I know will continue to be, a powerful advocate for this cause. Her work in pushing forward the cause and representing the voice of those infected and affected was unquestionably pivotal to reaching this point. I'd also like to thank my predecessor as Paymaster General, the Right Honourable Member for Salisbury. As I said yesterday at Questions, I'm grateful for his work in the lead up to announcing the compensation scheme, and indeed his collegiate approach in doing so. I hope we can continue to work together on this important issue. The scale of the horror that was uncovered by Sir Brian Longstaff's report almost defies belief, and one of the issues which the report brought to light is the importance of addressing the unacceptable culture of defensiveness in the public sector. We must make sure that the reputation of people and protecting institutions is never put above public service. This government will bring forward legislation to place the duty of candour on public servants and authorities to make sure this kind of behaviour cannot happen again. That legislation must be the catalyst for a changed culture in the public sector by improving transparency and improving accountability. It will address that culture of defensiveness and help ensure that the lack of candour uncovered in the infected blood scandal, and indeed in too many other instances such as Hillsborough and Horizon, is not again repeated. However, we also recognise that as well as delivering institutional change, we must also provide financial redress to the people whose lives have been irreversibly and tragically changed as a result of the infected blood scandal. One of the most powerful conclusions in the inquiry's report is that an apology is meaningful only if it is accompanied by action. It is now my responsibility to carry forward this action, and I hope to lead this work not only with the support of this House, but with sensitivity and respect towards the people who've been so unfairly affected by this scandal. After all that has happened, listening to the voice of victims is crucial, and I will endeavour to work closely with the infected blood community as we progress this work. I would also like to take this opportunity to update the House on the progress being made in establishing the Infected Blood Compensation Authority. The Victims and Prisoners Act legally created the authority on the 24th of May. Since this point, the interim Chief Executive, David Foley, has been working closely with Sir Robert Francis KC, the interim chair of the Infected Blood Compensation Authority, to set up the compensation service. It is frankly no small task. The Cabinet Office is supporting the organisation as it recruits and sets up a service that is easy to access and simple to use. The Infected Blood Compensation Authority itself will then provide regular updates to the infected blood community and all others interested in its work. Let me now turn to compensation. On 21st of May, I welcomed the former administration's announcement on compensation, and there's an urgent need to get money to people in the most timely way possible. Further interim payments of £210,000 were made to people who are beneficiaries of the infected blood support schemes living with infections on the 24th of June, bringing the total which has been paid in compensation to victims to over £1 billion. However, we recognise that this is not enough for many others who've been also waiting far too long. The Cabinet Office is working closely with DHSE, the devolved governments and the administrators of the existing infected blood support schemes to establish a process for making interim payments of £100,000 to the estates of the deceased people who were infected with contaminated blood or blood products and whose deaths have not yet been recognised. Work is progressing to ensure these payments are made as soon as we're able to, and I'm pleased to confirm to the House today that applications for these payments will open in October. The Government will set out further details of this in due course. There is also the matter of the final compensation scheme. We're committed to delivering this work and delivering it quickly. We're also committed to getting it right. The proposed compensation scheme was published on gov.uk on the 21st of May, and we're committed, as I indicated to the Shadow Paymaster General yesterday, to making regulations to establish a scheme by 24th of August, as we're obliged to do by the Victims and Prisoners Act. But we also recognise the importance of building the support and trust of those who will access the scheme. Sir Robert Francis undertook an engagement exercise in June at the former government's request with the support of all parties. This exercise engaged those who have been most impacted by the scandal on the content of the compensation scheme. I've been engaging with Sir Robert to hear his advice following his meetings with members of the infected blood community. I'm considering his advice carefully with a view to publishing both his report and the Government's position on this in advance of the 24th of August. Finally, I'd like to reassure the House that there will be an opportunity here to fully debate the content of the inquiry's final report. I'm conscious that given the timing of the recent election, there has not as yet been time for honourable members to do so, and it is essential, in my view, that members of this House have enough time to digest and debate the devastating findings the report sets out. The Government is considering Sir Brian Longstaff's recommendations, and we will provide an update to Parliament on the progress we're making to respond to the inquiry's recommendations by the end of the year, as Sir Brian recommended in his report. The infected blood scandal is one of the gravest injustices this country has seen. I want to end by paying tribute to the courage and determination of the victims of this scandal, those infected, those affected, who fought so hard for justice. And in every debate, we remember that they are at the centre of all of this, and it is for them that we must come together to restore the sense that this is a country that can rectify injustice. They deserve nothing less. I commend this statement to the House.
My Lords, this is a welcome statement, and I thank the Minister for repeating it. During the passage of the legislation that underpins the creation of the Infected Blood Compensation Scheme, one of the things that I'm very glad we all agreed upon across the House was that we should not let party politics interfere with our collective aim of reaching a fair and workable set of legal provisions in response to Sir Brian Langstaff's recommendations. And it is therefore particularly welcome to see that collegiate spirit continuing under the newly appointed ministerial team, and I thank them for that. The debate that took place last Friday in the other place served to clarify a number of important questions arising from the statement, and I therefore don't propose to dwell on matters that have already been covered. The main areas that I'd like to touch on relate in one way or another to the projected timetable for delivering compensation and justice in all its forms. It's excellent to hear that the recent period of election purdah did not prevent the further interim payments of £210,000 being made to beneficiaries of the infected blood support schemes living with infections, as was promised by the previous government. However, the other promise we made was to put in place as soon as possible arrangements to make an interim payment of £100,000 to the estates of deceased people who were infected with contaminated blood or blood products and whose deaths have not yet been recognised. To fulfil that promise, it's clearly necessary, as the statement indicated, to reach consensus between the devolved administrations and the government in Westminster, as well as those in charge of the existing support schemes, on how exactly those arrangements should be implemented. Can the Minister say how those discussions are progressing? Is she confident that when applications for those payments open in October, they will open across the United Kingdom as opposed to just a part or parts of the United Kingdom? Secondly, the statement made clear that the regulations to establish the scheme would be made on the 24th of August, which, as the Act provides, is 3 months, exactly 3 months after royal assent. I want to ask the Minister how procedurally and legally this will work. One of the risks that we identified when the Victims and Prisoners Bill was being debated was that a 3-month deadline for making regulations might be too rigid if the summer recess and or an election campaign meant that the regulations would have to be made at a time when Parliament wasn't sitting. Our solution to this was to create the Infected Blood Compensation Authority in shadow form with a view to timing royal assent for a date sometime in July, when we judged that the risk of a parliamentary recess or prorogation interfering with the making of regulations would be reduced. Because of reservations expressed by Labour shadow ministers, it wasn't possible to build any flexibility into the statute to allow for those risks, which, as things have turned out, may be seen as unfortunate, because royal assent had to happen as soon as the general election was announced. Can the Minister clarify what the legal effect will be of the regulations being made when Parliament is not sitting? At what point will the Infected Blood Compensation Authority be legally in being? Next, one of the key reassurances that I gave when taking the bill through was around the need to listen to the victims. We envisaged involving the infected blood community directly in 2 ways. First, in setting the final shape of the compensation scheme, and secondly, in assisting Sir Robert Francis as interim chair of the authority in ensuring that the scheme, when up and running, was implemented fairly and with the full benefit of input from those whose lives have been directly affected by this calamity. As regards the former, it's good news that Sir Robert Francis completed his engagement exercise last month and that he will be publishing the outcome in advance of the 24th of August. As regards the latter, can the Minister reassure the House that it is still the intention for the infected blood community to be represented in the Compensation Authority through its committees and subcommittees? And if so, is work proceeding now to give effect to that intention? Could I next ask the Minister to confirm a point that I know is still a matter of anxiety for the infected blood community? It's a question that concerns those currently in receipt of support payments. As the responsible Minister, I gave the House an assurance that no one will be worse off under the final compensation scheme than they would have been under existing support schemes, and that an additional top-up payment would be made to anyone assessed as being entitled to less money than would otherwise have been payable via the infected blood support schemes. In other words, I promised that those people who have a legitimate expectation of receiving a certain sum of money from support payments over their lifetime will have that expectation honoured. Can the Minister confirm the assurance that I gave? And following on from that, can she clarify for me whether what are now classed as ex gratia payments under the support schemes are now to be, in effect, rebadged as compensation? I'd like to touch also on a further concern within the infected blood community, which relates to access to necessary treatment. Victims have told me that parts of the NHS have been slow to recognise the moral and clinical urgency of treating those whose illness, or multiple illnesses in some cases, stem directly from receiving infected blood or blood products. Will the Minister ask her colleague in the Department of Health and Social Care to look into this and report to the House on how any difficulties of this sort might best be remedied? The Republic of Ireland, I understand, issues a special card to those people registered as having been infected by contaminated blood or blood products, so that there's no argument when someone presents themselves to the GP or to the hospital. Is that an idea that could be considered here? And whilst on the subject of treatment, can the Minister say whether everything is on track in NHS England and the devolved administrations to roll out the bespoke psychological support service for those infected and affected by the infected blood disaster? Finally, my Lords, the statement is right to pick up Sir Brian Langstaff's finding that there is a culture of institutional defensiveness that can too often rear its head in areas of the public sector. The government has stated its intention to bring forward a statutory duty of candour to address that issue, and indeed this was a proposal that we debated at some length during the passage of the Victims and Prisoners Bill. It's an idea that has an obvious appeal about it, and no doubt the government will bring forward legislation in due course when it's ready to do so. However, I said during our debate that it's an idea that merits a reasonably long run being taken at it before it's set in legislative stone. And I repeat that view today because I don't, in fact, think that a duty of candour is of itself a magic bullet that is capable of changing what is often an ingrained culture. The duty of candour that we have already in the NHS has not prevented some very serious and high-profile disasters arising out of poor care or even criminal behaviour. Similarly, we already have the Civil Service Code, which mandates honesty and transparency, but that hasn't, alas, prevented the kind of cover-ups and dishonesty in departments of government that Sir Brian Langstaff has highlighted. So could I ask the Minister, finally, whether any proposals to introduce a statutory duty of candour for the public sector as a whole will be preceded by extensive and thorough engagement with all those parts of the public sector to whom the duty is intended to apply?
My Lords, I first of all want to welcome the noble lady, the Minister, to her place, and I wish her well in the role that she is undertaking. And also we welcome from these benches this statement, and also commit to a collaborative cross-party approach to this very important issue. My Lords, victims of the infected blood scandal and their families have been waiting decades to see justice. And as we know, tragically, thousands have died without ever receiving compensation. The report of the inquiry into the scandal chaired by Sir Brian Langstaff laid bare the suffering inflicted, the cover-ups and the systematic failures of individuals and the British state as a whole. Not only did individuals and the state fail to help these victims, but in many cases people were lied to, treated with contempt and outright dismissed. However, my Lords, it is good to hear updates on progress, that Victims have waited far too long, and there are still some gaps. Following on from the Earl Howe, with regards to treatment from the NHS and some dismissive approaches from the NHS, rather than just the card idea, could I ask the Noble Lady, the Minister, with the onset of electronic patient records, would it be possible to put an automatic flag in patients' electronic patient records, which means that the onus is on the service and not on the individual to actually make sure that the treatment, timely treatment, is given by the NHS? It's also worth asking the Noble Lady, the Minister, the Infected Blood Compensation Authority will be set up, but what framework has been set for a light touch approach to those who are seeking compensation? We've seen that compensation schemes such as Horizon can be complex and actually difficult for those who have been affected to navigate. So could I ask what framework the Minister and the Government are asking the Compensation Authority to undertake that makes it as light touch as possible, but obviously with appropriate probity in place? Another problem with the Government's proposals for compensation is that only infected victims and bereaved partners are entitled to the Autonomy Award, which is being used as a catch-all to cover, for example, clinical trials and the loss to the right to have children. Affected parents, my lords, cannot claim for this award of £50,000, but it's the only measure that looks to compensate the financial outlay of supporting the child or children of the deceased and their partners over many years. Another issue with the Autonomy Award that it does not recognise affected and infected partners who have pregnancies terminated as a result of links to their blood infection. So does the Minister not agree that there is a good case for the Autonomy Award to be extended to specific affected individuals who can prove injury? And I look forward to the answers of the Noble Lady, the Minister.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Noble Earl Lord Howe and the Noble Lord Scriven for their contributions and for the thoughtful response. In relation in particular to the Noble Earl, he's spoken from these benches many times with great sensitivity and consideration, and I hope we can work closely together on this issue as we move forward. And I'd also like to pay tribute to the work of many noble lords from across your Lordship's house, including my noble friend Lord Ponsonby of Shelbury, the Noble Lady Baroness Thornton, who worked closely with the Noble Earl Lord Howe and the Government throughout the passage of the Victims and Prisoners Act to put in place the legislation required to provide the necessary legal framework to establish the arm's length body and pay compensation without any further undue delays. Indeed, I'm also would be remiss not to thank the Noble Ladies Baroness Brinton, Baroness Campbell of Surbiton, Baroness Theverston, Baroness Meacham, Baroness Finlay and all other noble lords for their work on this matter over many years to reach this point. The work of Sir Brian Langstaff should also be recognised at this point. As the chair of the Infected Blood Inquiry, his comprehensive work for the past 7 years, and not least the victims and families of the infected blood scandal, who were for far too long not given a voice, it's critical that we in your Lordship's house continue to speak about this important issue. The Infected Blood Inquiry's report brought to light the enormity of the scandal, the lives which have been shattered and the voices which have been ignored for decades. The inquiry described the infected blood scandal as a collective failing and provided a clear and powerful depiction of the subtle, pervasive and chilling aspects of the scandal, which must not be forgotten. I pledge to this House and that this Government is committed to action and ensuring that we work on across the House, across your Lordship's house, to ensure that those who've endured unspeakable injustices finally receive the justice they deserve. I'll now turn to some specific questions that the Noble Lords have raised, and apologies if I don't manage to cover all of them. I will write with detail if this isn't possible. The government does recognise that no amount of money will make right the wrongdoings of the infected blood scandal. However, the government does feel that the compensation scheme is a step towards providing recognition for those infected and affected by this tragedy. And I note the comments by the Noble Lord, Lord Scriven, that this shouldn't be a complicated process, and I will feed that back following this debate on this statement. Sir Robert Francis Casey recently concluded an engagement exercise on the previous government's proposals for the infected blood compensation scheme, as noted by the Noble Earl, and the Minister for the Cabinet Office has been engaging with Sir Robert to hear his advice following his meetings with members of the infected blood community, and is considering this carefully with a view to publishing both his report and the government's position on this in advance of the 24th of August. And in relation to how this will be dealt with over the summer, there will be the process that will be followed will be the made affirmative process. Sorry, I do have it somewhere later on, but it felt like the appropriate point to mention it here. So there will be a made affirmative procedure that will be followed, and in due course there will be a full debate in your Lordship's House, which I understand will take place in September. In relation to interim payments, it's important that, as well as providing sufficient time to review Sir Robert Francis's findings, we don't forget that speed is of the essence as well as simplicity. And over £1 billion has been paid so far in interim compensation. And I'm pleased that on Friday last week, the Minister for the Cabinet Office announced that applications for interim payments of £100,000 to estates of the deceased people who are infected with contaminated blood or blood products and who've not yet been recognised will open in October, and the government will set out further details in due course. The proposed tariffs for the compensation scheme have been developed using the work of the Infected Blood Inquiry Response Expert Group, which included clinical and legal advisors assisted by social care specialists. The proposed tariffs have been developed with reference to judicial guidelines. However, in line with the inquiry's recommendations, the government has not been constrained by practice in the courts in setting compensation rates. There won't be any immediate changes to the infected blood support schemes. Under the current proposal, payments will continue to be made at the same level until the 31st of March next year, and they will not be deducted from any compensation awards. And from the 1st of April next year, people who receive an infected blood support scheme payments will continue to receive payments until such time that their case is assessed under the new scheme by the Infected Blood Compensation Authority. And I understand the Noble Earl Howe asked about the issue of support for estates payments, and I'd like to reassure him that we are working across government and with the devolved administrations to ensure that that process for obtaining probate or confirmation is as smooth as possible for applicants. In relation to the duty of candour, the Noble Earl rightly raised concern around making sure that the actual duty of candour is rolled out properly, and the government will bring forward legislation to place a duty of candour on public servants and authorities to make sure that this kind of behaviour cannot happen again. This will be done through the Hillsborough Bill, which will be a means of putting measures in place to ensure those working in the public sector would be rightly held to a high standard of candour. Cultures and behaviours also need to change. It's not just about legislation, but this bill will support that change by bringing about consequences for those who fall to standards. I have taken on board what the Noble Earl said about how consultation should include those affected, and I will feed that back. I don't yet have details of that, but I will write to the Noble Earl at the earliest opportunity. In relation to the Noble Earl's specific questions around assurance that no one will be worse off, I can give you assurance around that. And I think the Cabinet Office is working very closely with the Department of Health and Social Care and other relevant departments and organisations to give recommendations for consideration, and I'm happy to pick that up at ministerial level as well. I've already covered the regulation process and the made affirmative procedure. Just very briefly, because I'm mindful of time, and moving on to the questions and answers. The committees and subcommittees will include members of the community, and I think that there's in a recent newsletter, the Infected Blood Compensation Authority announced it is recruiting a permanent role for user consultant to help shape its work, and this role will only be open to those who've lived experience of the infected blood scandal. Finally, before I conclude, I can reassure the Noble Earl that the NHS support is now in place in England as well. So I want to assure Noble Lords on all sides of the Lordship's House that I want to work together closely as we progress this work, as I think has been the case in recent years, as the Noble Earl himself has worked very closely on this, and it's essential we do this on a cross-party basis. That's the only way that we can face up to the failures of the past and make sure that tragedies on this scale never happen again. And this will take leadership and a change of culture to move away from what Sir Brian Langstaff understandably described as an institutional defensiveness, and moving away from that is absolutely critical.
Just in urgency into the point about full compensation. Noble Lord Earl Howe rightly referred to the urgent need for treatment for these victims of the infected blood scandal. I mean, it's ironic we talk about urgency of treatment or compensation decades after this thing happened, but nevertheless it's good to hear that from the Noble Lord Earl Howe. The Minister has referred to interim payments on a number of occasions during her speeches. But, you know, these people don't just need interim payments. These people have suffered and suffered and suffered for decades, and they need and deserve the full compensation as a matter of absolute urgency. And I would simply wish to leave that thought with the Minister.
Yeah.
I'd just like to reassure the Noble Lady that the government is absolutely committed to paying comprehensive compensation to infected and affected victims of the infected blood scandal. And this is such a priority for the Prime Minister that he stated this publicly on his second day in office. So I hope that the Noble Lady can take some reassurance from that.
My Lords, could I welcome my noble friend to the front bench? And in her statement today, she indicated that the Cabinet Office was working closely with the Department of Health and Social Care and the devolved governments and administrations and administrators of the existing infected blood support schemes to establish the process for making interim payments of $100,000 to the estates of deceased people who were infected with contaminated blood or blood products. Could my noble friend further elaborate on this issue and say at what stage in the devolved administrations will be ready to make such payments? Because, as others know only too well, these people have waited a considerable time, both victims and their families, for due compensation, and they also want to know, will support schemes continue in some format?
I'd like to thank my noble friend for her question, and I think the urgency of ensuring that those affected and infected receive compensation is it's really difficult to talk about urgency when quite clearly people have waited, in some cases decades, to get justice. And officials and there's a lot of dialogue going on at official level with the devolved administrations, and will be taking place at ministerial level as well. So I think that the applications for interim payments will be open in October, and it is of absolute urgency that must go smoothly. So those discussions that will continue to take place over the summer in advance of the 24th of August where the made affirmative procedure will go through. It's vital those continue to proceed, and applications for the payments will open across the piece in October, and the compensation scheme will be a priority for this government. As I said, the Prime Minister made it a priority for him to reaffirm this on his second day in office.
Lords, that the Minister raised the issue of a duty of candour as a mechanism to make sure that such horrors are not repeated. But will she take on board that a duty of candour alone, and Neil Howe raised this point, that is completely insufficient, so long as those who speak out become victims of retaliation, which is almost the norm rather than the exception, despite the existence of employment tribunals, which are completely unfit for purpose in dealing with these situations, that then the words will... People will not be speaking out because they're not prepared to martyr their complete careers and their family future. So will she please support actions to provide proper protections for whistleblowers? Obviously, I've had bills before this House, but can that become a priority? Because without that, a duty of candour is ineffective.
So I think the duty of candour really matters, and I appreciate people are concerned about making sure we protect public servants, and that's right, and we should have protection around that as well. But the duty of candour also relates to making sure that we have a culture within all our public services where things go wrong, people are able to say something's gone wrong, and we don't have cover-up after cover-up. And that's not just about whistleblowing, that's actually about a culture that has actually protected the establishment and left people vulnerable and unprotected who've been infected and affected by the infected blood and infected blood products in this instance. But time and again, when we have public inquiries, we see that people did know, people didn't speak out, and actually people haven't always spoken out initially when there's been some sort of formal public inquiry. So you can't just do that by having a duty of candour within legislation. It has to be about the culture. That culture has to also respect that when whistleblowers do speak out, that they are protected. But that isn't just about legislation, that's also about the culture in which we want to operate our public services across the piece.
My Lords, are there any more questions for this particular statement? I don't see anybody rising to speak. So we'll